Good afternoon, and somewhat unexpectedly, a general election has been called for the 4th of July 2024. Now, frankly, the way Britain conducts democracy is rubbish. The winning party always receives a minority of the vote. Additionally, your constituency could be a very safe seat of a particular party, and your vote probably won't have much say. However, you do still get to vote. There is a democracy behind all this. Of course, though, deciding on a party is rather difficult. Most people have their own personal priorities, and I imagine that most of us here have transport as ours. So, seeing as transport doesn't usually get that much coverage in election cycles, I thought it might be a good idea to go through the different parties' manifestos and compare their transport policies from an as objective stance as possible. That said, I will be sharing some of my personal opinions here, and you are free to disagree with me in the comments, but please be civil. Oh, and if you're in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, I'm afraid this video won't be much use. I am sorry, but I just don't have the time to cover all the non-English parties. The Liberal Democrats were the first party to release their manifesto, so we shall start with them. Historically, the Liberals were one of the two main parties, but they were superseded by Labour in the middle of the 20th century. They nonetheless retained some success, and in the 2010 election even formed a coalition government with the Conservatives. Unfortunately for them, though, the coalition appears to have devastated their reputation. They ran on a campaign highlighting broken promises made by other parties, so it wasn't taken very well when, for example, they tripled tuition fees after promising to abolish them. Now, you can't really blame the Lib Dems entirely for this. The Conservatives were the leading partner in the coalition, and they were pursuing austerity politics, where government spending is cut to a bare minimum. Despite this nuance, though, many Lib Dem voters had a bad taste left in their mouth, and the party subsequently lost a lot of support. They're not even the third largest in Parliament anymore. However, they are still an important player, and are the main opposition to the Conservatives in many rural areas, particularly in the southwest. Anyway, their manifesto. I personally think it's quite good overall, but transport feels decidedly poorly thought through. I like their pledge to bring back the 2030 deadline on zero-emission vehicles, but I'm not sure it's really practical after last year's deferment to 2035. It would send yet another signal that the UK is not a stable place to invest, and 2030 is less than 6 years away now. There just wouldn't be enough time for manufacturers to adapt to the new regulations. It's also apparent that they're not just nervous of the word renationalisation, they're nervous of the policy. Unlike Labour, and even the Conservatives, the Lib Dems haven't actually proposed any real structural reform to the railways, and certainly no nationalisation. They instead suggest a new railway agency, a public body that, in their own words, would help to join up the industry. But it doesn't look like it will be running the railway itself. It would merely regulate private operators, and that approach has been tried before with the Strategic Rail Authority. In case you hadn't noticed, it's no longer around. I'm a little disappointed that there's no clear commitment to reinstate the northern legs of HS2, but even a review is much better than anything any other party is suggesting. Some other things that look great are just a continuation of existing policies, like the Access for All scheme. And what do they mean by saying they'll implement light rail schemes where appropriate? That's not really a commitment, and by not giving any examples, they leave a lot of room for them to wiggle out of any promises. That said, there are some excellent rail policies here. A 10-year plan for rail electrification is necessary, as is an international rail strategy. It's so disappointing how inadequate our international services are at the moment, and some thought going into improving them will be much appreciated. I'm a little sceptical of an annual rail pass, but it could work in theory. On the subject of ticketing, the Lib Dems have pledged to freeze rail fares and simplify the system. Now, that letter pledge has been made many times by many people and hasn't happened yet, so do take it with a pinch of salt. But if you were to read it at face value, then surely simplified ticketing would contradict frozen fares. Okay, I'm being pedantic. What I think they mean is that they won't increase rail fares every year, as currently happens. I can get behind that. They also want to keep the £2 bus cap. No surprises there, this is going to be quite a difficult change to reverse, and to introduce a young person's bus card, effectively a 16 to 25 rail card, but for buses. That's great, but why do they need a separate card? They also give a vague intention to work to integrate bus, rail and light rail ticketing systems. Again, this is a common feature of manifestos in the past, and that's not surprising. It's a very vague statement. Of course, these things shouldn't really be up to national governments and national parties. Competent and well-funded transport organisations should be able to do this of their own accord, but I digress. I'll talk about this in a future video. Miscellaneously, is that a word? The Lib Dems have some unequivocally good policies, like accelerating EV charging, switching to electric buses, delivering Northern Powerhouse, requiring airlines to show carbon emissions for domestic flights compared to the equivalent rail option, that I love, and banning short domestic flights where a train would take less than 2.5 hours. On the whole, it's an impressive, if not perfect, manifesto. The Lib Dems won't win the general election, but at a constituency level, if their candidate was good, I wouldn't have any qualms about voting for them. Now for the manifesto we'll be getting used to over the next few years. Labour. They're going to win. I have to say, this took me by surprise. It's a more ambitious manifesto than I was expecting. Their general message is one of stability and good governance, but they also pledge things like a national wealth fund, which is great. As for transport, I was also very impressed. A 10-year infrastructure strategy, for more than just rails, by the way, is much needed and will really help, I think. And whilst they really do need to be careful with this, some form of planning reform is essential. Their flagship policy on rail reform is Great British Railways, which equates to nationalisation, though rolling stock will still be privately owned. I do have a few gripes with this plan. Indeed, I was talking about them in the video I was making just before the election was called and I had to chop everything. But on the whole, whilst it won't be a perfect system, it's certainly better than what we have at the moment. Yet, on a second look, their manifesto on transport appears to be inadequate by omission. What are they playing at with cars remain by far the most popular form of transport? It's not a popularity contest. People don't choose their method of transport based on which one they have a burning passion for. Well, I do, but most people don't. This is a really disconcerting trend we've seen in British politics recently. The Conservatives started it in the middle of 2023 and Labour appears to have conceded. Labour don't commit to a modal shift, and they don't appear to acknowledge that car usage is too high. This isn't some radical wishful thinking. It's been the policy of the Conservative government for the past 14 years, or at least it was until last year when things kind of went off the rails, literally and figuratively. Anyway, we're supposed to be talking about Labour, not the Conservatives. It's not really like the former have got anything wrong in their manifesto, it's an odd focus. Perhaps I'm being unfair though. Labour spends a lot more time talking about public transport than they do roads. But whilst their plan for rail is quite well fleshed out, they don't go far enough with buses. It's just like the Lib Dems. They promise to give power to local authorities and leave it at that. But local authorities just aren't going to be able to solve this problem. They don't have the funding, and even if they did, there are far too many of them to create a cohesive system. And also, what does it mean, this will give local communities in England control over routes and schedules? They can kind of do that already. You can set up a community bus company, that's something you're allowed to do. But that doesn't happen very often because there isn't enough money for it. I'm not commenting on how good or bad community bus companies are, rather that you don't only need powers, you need the ability to use them. There's also no commitment on HS2, Northern Powerhouse, or any other new railway for that matter. Even the existing Beaching Reversal Fund appears to have vanished. Again, it's not like this is really bad, it's just vague. The hope is that experts will come in and fill in the gaps and everything will all turn out fine. But at the end of the day, that's still a hope, and we will have to wait and see. All in all, Labour doesn't promise as much as I would have hoped on transport. That said, their rail policy document was sufficiently detailed and well informed that there is reason to believe that they won't be like this in government. There are a lot of fantastic and very knowledgeable people whose expertise could be utilised by an incoming government, and it is entirely possible that this is what we could see. Still, without commitments, how are we supposed to know for sure? Now, on to the Conservatives. Their manifesto throws a lot of money around, and I don't fully trust their costings. But hold on, I hear you say. Just a few minutes ago you were complaining that Labour needs to be spending more. Well yes, but there's a huge difference between frantically tossing money up in the air and hoping it'll win you votes, and spending much needed funds on targeted strategic investments that will help strengthen Britain's productivity. As for the actual stuff they promise, well, it is just fluttering money away. 4.7 billion for smaller cities, towns and rural areas, but 8.3 billion for potholes? I mean, focusing on that last one, let's just do a few back-of-the-envelope calculations. According to the annual Local Authority Road Maintenance Survey in 2022, the average pothole filling in England costs about £46. That means the Conservatives plan to fill over 180 million potholes within 5 years. Oh sorry, no. By the looks of it, they'll try and do it all in just 2. That means they want to fill more than 247,000 potholes a day. But even if they were able to achieve this incredible speed, the RAC estimates that there are only around 1 million potholes in the UK at the moment. Now, to be fair, I do think the RAC have massively underestimated there, and 180 million doesn't sound too implausible, but we don't know, and the Conservatives don't either. They've just pledged a gigantic sum of money on what's basically guesswork. Now, an incredibly charitable interpretation of this pledge would be that in practice they'd actually focus on a more cohesive road upgrade strategy. Road redesigns don't sound sexy, but in reality they can make a huge difference to people's lives. Many countries across Europe, including Belgium and the Netherlands, have spent a lot of money over the past decade redesigning their roads. Not only does good road design look nice, improving people's well-being, it can also reduce noise and even air pollution, potentially traffic congestion too. Oh, and most importantly of all, it can save lives. But let's be honest, is this what they're really talking about when they say road resurfacing? No, they mean new layers of asphalt. This is a real shame. If you're pledging that money, you might as well do it in a way that makes Britain a better place to live in. That's just one example though. The whole manifesto is kind of like that. Frankly, it's just desperate virtue signalling with no thought behind the suggestions. Even when they do identify a real problem quite well, like how long it takes us to build infrastructure in the UK, they undermine it by following it up with blatantly untrue statements, like the EU being responsible for slow infrastructure delivery. That's obviously not true. Look at Spain or France or Italy. But let's just hold ourselves for a moment. Forgetting all context, there are some unequivocally good policies in this manifesto, like pay-as-you-go ticketing nationwide and measures to protect pedestrians, cyclists and other vulnerable road users. But they're completely overshadowed by their embrace of conspiracy theories, insulting oversteps on local authorities and countries, and generally, but most importantly, their record. Sure, they say they'll support hundreds of new bus routes, but they promised better buses in the past. Again and again. And over their time in power, half of British bus routes have been cut. Of course, not everything in the manifesto is going to be implemented. Circumstances change, and I get that. But, in my opinion, such a disgusting attitude to transport policy over the past few years is unforgivable. To be honest, when you compare it to other departments, transport has got off pretty lightly too. There has been some real progress, like with cycling infrastructure, but incompetence prevails, and a vote for the Conservatives at this election is a very hard sell. Okay, but what if you are right-wing? Who do you vote for if not the Conservatives? Well, Reform UK, the new party that's really been pushing itself recently, would like you to vote for them. There is a problem though. They're completely delusional. They say they will take a pragmatic approach, and in their eyes that involves scrapping HS2, the infrastructure project that billions have already been spent on and is already under construction. Look, London to Birmingham is past the point of no return. You can't cancel Phase 1. And what do they mean, stop the war on drivers? Firstly, I wasn't aware of any explicit war, but our streets shouldn't be violent battlegrounds, so I agree with that in principle. But if there is a war, then the drivers are certainly winning. In 2022, 385 pedestrians were killed by drivers, and almost 6,000 were seriously injured. To put it another way, more pedestrians were killed by drivers in 1 year than British servicemen were killed in the Falklands War. That's not even counting the deaths or injuries of cyclists, the deaths resulting from car-on-car collisions, or the nearly 50,000 people annually who die early as a result of air pollution. But no, it's the drivers who are having a war waged against them. Obviously, this whole premise is complete nonsense. As I was saying earlier, people aren't inherently drivers or cyclists or pedestrians or whatever. They choose the best mode for their journey, dependent on the means available. Tweaking the ways those means are balanced is not a war on anyone, it's just a rightful alteration in the face of, I don't know, several thousand dead people a year. And then you throw everything else into the mix, like land use, cost, the young and the elderly, climate change, and a near infinite list of other considerations. In light of all this, does a ban on clean air zones really seem like a good idea? And how do you ban a low-traffic neighbourhood exactly? The capitalised version of low-traffic neighbourhood is just an artificial cul-de-sac. Should we ban them too? And it makes a lot of sense to restrict through traffic on certain side streets. It's good transport planning. Also, here, we will keep the speed limit low where safety is critical. Where is safety not critical? Of course, there is room for debate about where speed limits should be. But instigating a speed limit review would be a much better pledge than this nothing. They give a few more vague promises, and then actually some quite good ideas about simplifying funding processes. But the party as a whole is questionable. It's a limited company, not a political party, and it has an ethically dubious culture. I don't want to get too deep into this, but let me put it like this. Even if the party itself is not racist or Islamophobic or whatever, it does seem to attract people who do think that way. Reform clearly haven't done enough to vet their candidates properly, so Farage should at least accept that people are naturally going to ask questions about his intentions when he has attacked Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party for not doing enough to deal with anti-Semitism. Questioning Corbyn was reasonable, but so is questioning Farage. Putting all this aside though, if you genuinely want right-wing policies, vote for the Conservatives. Despite everything, they're still your best bet. No pun intended. But I imagine that most of you here are not yourselves Conservatives, and even those of you who are probably reluctant to vote Tory. Equally though, the other parties don't really present much exciting. It feels as if they're just trying to offend as few people as possible, rather than actually present a particularly positive vision. But there is a party that claims to offer that. The Greens. They've been doing well in some areas and have promised to spend big in their manifesto, and whilst they obviously won't win the election, they may provide pressure in Parliament. So, should we all vote Green? Well, the transport section of their manifesto is very detailed, and the little synopsis of their policy is okay, but I do think it's fundamentally flawed. Like so many other parties, they commit to just sums of money rather than specific projects, and that's not how we should be operating. We should decide what needs to be done and then pay for it, rather than frantically searching for ways to spend cash that's already been allocated with no real idea where it's going to go. Now obviously it's a sliding scale. Committing $2.5 billion to cycleways and footways makes sense. It would be ridiculous if central government was outlining specific new cycle lanes. But for things that national government should be dealing with, like electrification, you should be listing projects rather than trying to meet some spending quota. After all, a little bit of money spent well is better than a lot wasted. That said, they seem to be the only party explicitly recognising that poor bus services are damaging the economy. Indeed, as they say, every £1 invested in buses brings an economic return of £4.50. They also commit to a bus service to every village. Now, I've spoken to some senior Green Party officials, and it turns out that that pledge refers to the Every Village, Every Hour report made by the Campaign to Protect Rural England a few years ago. That was an excellent report, by the way. It estimated that running an hourly bus service to every village in the country from 6 AM to midnight, 7 days a week, would cost about £2.7 billion a year. Well worth it. It's policies like that parties should be promoting. Clear, relatively straightforward, and very beneficial to transport. But as for who should run the buses, the Greens stick with Labour and the Lib Dems policy of just empowering local authorities. Again, I'm making a video on this, but local authority bus companies are not the way forward. They'd be way too small. We need larger, regional companies set up by national government. I'm not particularly enamoured with their rail policy meanwhile, but there are 3 things that stand out. First, they offer to not only nationalise railway operations, but also rolling stock. That's pretty important. At the moment, trains are owned by private companies and leased to the operator, which is expensive. Secondly, they suggest a national strategic approach to identifying lines that should be reopened. That's pretty obviously good. It's something that's not in the manifesto though that's the final interesting thing about rail. Whilst they don't commit to HS2, they don't commit to stopping it either. I think this abandonment of a long-held policy is emblematic of the change the Greens are going through at the moment. They're formalising and becoming a much more serious party, which is less focused on minor activism and more on serious governance. Still, I think it'll be a long time before they start backing high-speed rail. Not mentioning HS2 at all isn't good, it's just better than it used to be. As for roads policy, well, it's more provocative, shall we say. They throw in a few things that raise a lot of eyebrows, like road pricing, which, whilst it could work, is perhaps a little contentious at the moment. Furthermore, 2027 is far too soon for a ban on new petrol and diesel vehicles. A flat ban on them being driven after 2035 is also a bit extreme. That would involve an unrealistically quick and pricey transition. However, road tax should definitely be made proportional to vehicle weight. Hopefully that would get a grip on the ridiculous vehicle sizes we've been seeing recently. There's much less to say about their discussions on active travel and aviation. They're all pretty sensible. They want to increase walking and cycling and reduce flying. It's the Greens, what do you expect? Well, actually, I would expect a little more. Why do we completely forget about ships when we talk about transport? Britain used to have a nationalised ferry system, Sea Link, and it was profitable and innovative. Alas, though, it was privatised in the 1980s, and now our ferries are run by private companies, most of which are foreign. P&O, for example, is owned by Dubai's DP World. In the intervening period, while service has arguably got better, the number of routes has declined significantly. For example, there used to be many options going to Scandinavia. Now, there are none. It's not like these are ridiculous long distances that no one would ever sail across. Newcastle to Oslo, for example, will be shorter than Portsmouth to Bilbao in Spain, a very popular route that involves 1 or 2 nights on the ferry. Obviously, not everyone would choose to sail across Europe, but plenty would. They're just not given the option. A new ferry route is relatively quick, easy and cheap to establish, but setting up a state ferry company would boost trade, reduce emissions, increase our international standing, and may even make us money. It seems like such an obvious policy to pursue. Why ferries never seem to appear in political agendas is beyond me. Okay, back to the Green Party. Whilst they do have some great individual policies, the package isn't complete yet, in my opinion. If the Greens seem likely to win in your area, then by all means vote for them, but if not, I don't think it's worth giving them your support yet. In a few years' time, though, they may have matured even further. Watch this space. So all in all, who is the best choice? Well, it really depends. In my view, and the view of many others, the most important thing at this election is getting rid of the Conservative Party. For reasons separate to transport, they've left the country in quite a poor physical state. But there's also the psychological damage that has been inflicted. Whether we notice it or not, there's a spirit of national decline, that we're no longer capable of doing great things or being ambitious. We have, as a country and a political system, become obsessed with restricting short-term spending, forgetting the long-term cost of not doing anything. And that's when we even acknowledge the problems. Of course, we absolutely still can make meaningful change. In fact, we may have no choice. Frankly, we have to prove that democracy is still capable of delivering, and that our citizens can trust the system. We're not at risk of invasion or anything like that, but as people get more disillusioned with politics, the risk of extremism grows ever greater. Keir Starmer is right to say that if you want change, you've got to vote for it. But if you promise change, you've also got to deliver it. To be honest, there's not much that we, personally, can do to help bring about that change. But that doesn't mean there's nothing. You could join a political party or a pressure group that campaigns for better transport in your area. If that's too much commitment, why not just write to your local candidates, or the MP when they get elected? Asking them their thoughts on public transport and what they plan to do about it would help keep it on their mind in Parliament. Anyway, I'm sorry this video went on a bit, but thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Oh, and don't forget your ID when you go to vote.